In Spain, there's a September haze. It's a country that exemplifies the European dream of a prosperous life buoyed by a generous welfare state. It's a country used to fiesta and dance, regality and ceremony, to pomp and victory. A nation that has, in the past, run with the bulls and lived to tell another tale, has now been trampled in its path.
Nosotros somos el Lehman Brothers de Europa.
Spain is the Lehman Brothers of Europe.
Today in Spain, the drumbeat of progress has stopped, and the song that it sings is off-key. With anticipation heavy in the air and the political and financial future of Europe and its place in the world at stake, those looking for clues on how best to emerge from the Great Recession are turning to the Iberian Peninsula.
That Spain is the linchpin. Spain is the country in which the crucial battle for the Eurozone is being fought.
Recent news that Germany, Europe's economic powerhouse, posted its fastest growth rate since the end of the Cold War, has lifted spirits in some parts of the Eurozone. But here in Spain, the continent's fifth largest economy, the symptoms of the Great Recession remain acute. A high budget deficit, a troubled banking sector, a polarized political system, and a state hamstrung by resurgent regional governments. Integral to the European economic project, but locked in its worst recession since emerging from fascist dictatorship, Spain is frozen in a moment that history may judge as watershed for the continent, and a test of how far governments can and should go to unfreeze progress. Is the country too big to fail, or too big to save? And if it needs saving, who will do it? A country that has always had reason to dance is settling in for a distinctly European hangover. Despite Spain's economic anguish, celebrations aren't difficult to find here, increasingly ironic as they are spectacular, as many of the nation's 5 million unemployed, like Elena Ortega, can attest to.
I feel frustrated. I feel sad every day.
Elena has 2 university degrees, having studied the tourism industry, and speaks 3 languages. She now finds herself applying for reception jobs, only to discover there are thousands of applications for the same low-paying position.
As you are searching on internet, you can see the state of your application. So nobody opened my CV. Nobody read it. It's impossible to get a job.
Spain's 20% unemployment rate, the highest in the Eurozone, is even worse for young people. Some 40% of them under 25 are not working.
I want to go to the beach, but I want to work as well. I don't mind working like 9 hours, 10 hours. I don't mind.
I wake up in the morning and I see my daughter and I say, I don't want to go to work. And I go to work.
That money is important to feed your family, to pay for electricity, gas, the mortgage, to live.
And at the end of the month, nothing happens.
You ask yourself 1,000 things. What have I done wrong? Is this fair?
We're working 8 hours and suffering more than people who are not working. By December, they'll owe me 6,000 euros.
They owe me 10,000 euros.
My husband is a bus driver, and he's also had job complications this year. He earns 300 euros less a month than a year ago. If it wasn't because we asked my mother for money, we wouldn't have been able to pay the mortgage some months, for sure, because we didn't receive any income for almost 6 months. 2013 looks even worse because payment delays are going to continue and subsidies will probably be cut. For now, I'm going to keep my job, and while we can, we'll hang on.
Mickey Mouse! When your salary gets paid that day, it seems like the sun has risen 3 times. It's a day of joy. I work in a tile factory, and in 2008, it started having trouble paying both workers and suppliers. Very few imagine that we'd reach 2012 being so much worse than how we were in 2008. Now the company is bankrupt. It's going to disappear, and we're going to be unemployed. It's very sad arriving to the factory and seeing everything stopped. There's no noise, you don't see the tiles coming out, it's like everything's dead. My husband is on pension because of a work accident 16 years ago. He can't stand or sit for long periods of time. One good thing is that his pension income is fixed. Right now, we're surviving thanks to the help of my mother and my brother. They've lent us money to eat. In 2010 and 2011, after a few months of not getting paid and delays, and with the company not taking responsibility for anything, my coworkers and I decided to take it to court so an impartial judge could decide. At the end, we won. We've been paid part of the money we were owed. There's another part we have not been paid, and possibly will never receive it. The only way of earning that is the government salary fund, where we'll lose around 1/3 of the money we're owed, more or less. Now that the company is closing, to tell you the truth, I don't feel any relief. I hope to find another job. I think it's going to be very difficult, very, very difficult. But the last thing you lose is hope. At least that's how I think. I try not to let it get to me, and overall to not pass that bitterness onto my family. We don't need to be sad. That's not going to feed us.
Most here understand the goal of making money, but don't understand the means which have left them. So why is Spain so pivotal for the European financial crisis and even the global economic crisis?
Is the world going to get Europe out of the crisis, or will Europe drag the rest of the world with it?
Nosotros somos el Lehman Brothers de Europa.
Spain is the Lehman Brothers of Europe. Bankruptcy is unavoidable, more or less.
He thinks the rigid nature of Spain's economy, the interconnectedness of the markets, and German banks' exposure to both public and high private debt in Spain all paint a grim picture.
Tiene unos mercados rígidos. Tiene un endeudamiento alto.
Spain can't devaluate its money. It has to work within the EU with all the deficit requirements related to that. Spain is dependent on foreign investment. It's too late. It's crossed a line. Public debt plus private debt is 270% of GDP. Who's going to be the hero that's going to save a country in this situation? There's no one who's going to do that.
The world is afraid that the PIGS countries can't pay back their foreign debt. Spain has a high budget deficit, but not a high debt, which is the opposite of Greece. So what's the problem? It's no big deal. Nothing's going to happen. And besides, you have the IMF. That could solve the problem anyway.
Spain's situation is bringing to light questions about the political structure of Europe's union. Policymakers are grappling with how much more integration might be needed and would be possible between countries which share a common currency but have in many cases different fiscal strategies and, of course, cultures and languages.
This is about the financial system, but in fact, it is launching a process of reform of global governance.
What the crisis has shown is that the Eurozone as it stands doesn't work. This monetary union with lack of a sufficient degree of fiscal coordination does not work. To make it work, there is a need for very serious institutional reform, and I see very little political appetite for it.
As some sectors of the Spanish economy are buoyant, there is a growing acknowledgement that regardless of what happens, the decades of ample welfare and government subsidies are ending.
As the main tourist season comes to an end in Spain, record unemployment is biting once again. 1 in 4 Spaniards are now out of work, and for many that also, of course, means being out on the street too. Over 500,000 people have been evicted in the past 5 years. Sarah Firth's got the story behind those numbers.
The picture of suburban bliss. But glance a little closer and the cracks start to appear. Take a look around you and what do you see? It's a nice building in a relatively affluent part of the country north of Madrid. You can see, looking at the window boxes in the front of the building, that it's well kept. But all the people who live here have one thing in common, and that's that none of them pay rent. Since the crisis hit, evictions have gone through the roof. From 2008, more than 250,000 Spaniards have received eviction orders because they were unable to pay their mortgages. Like everyone else living in this complex, this family moved in after being evicted from their old home.
We used to live in Alcalá de Henares, but had to move here. Our old place was lovely, but you know, we're living in a crisis, and when we couldn't afford it anymore, we sought help and were moved here.
The family received the support of a protest movement that helps people who've lost their homes or can no longer afford to pay rent. They helped place the family in a flat here. The flat they live in now, like the whole development, is just one of many properties that since Spain's housing bubble burst have been standing empty. The developer of these properties is fighting a legal battle, but lawyers working with the protest movement are determined to fight back.
One of the reasons for the creation of this organisation was a tsunami of evictions, a wave of economic crisis. Society understands that this is not just a crisis, but a scam. We were robbed. We were left without healthcare, education, and now houses. And we are left with debts. And yet the banks are full of money, all gathered from struggling taxpayers.
Due in large part to the continued pressure from campaign groups, the government announced a 2-year moratorium on evictions at the end of 2012. But many families here feel the emergency legislation doesn't go far enough and that they're left fending for themselves.
We all want to get water and electricity. We don't have it here.
Despite small signs of Eurozone recovery, Spain remains a country with one of the highest levels of unemployment. And with more than 1 in 4 people in the country out of work, the families fighting to remain here, rent and mortgage-free, could well have some new neighbours very soon. Sarah Firth, RT, Spain.
It looks like an ordinary summer's day for these children at a swimming pool on the outskirts of Sevilla in southern Spain. But this is a special day for them. They're here with social workers from the organisation Between Friends. They are part of the millions of Spaniards who are not reaping the benefits of the economic upturn. We travel with them to their neighbourhood in Polígono Sur, known as the 3,000 Homes, one of the poorest in Spain. The children are among hundreds who receive free meals from the organisation over the summer holidays in schools across the neighbourhood. It's part of a programme launched nationwide 3 years ago by the NGO Educo.
Requests for our summer meals have gone up by 40% compared to last year. The economic crisis has led to budget cuts in social funding, education, health. That's led to many families trying to cut down on food spending. Nobody is going hungry, but there is malnutrition in Spain.
More than 40% of children live in poverty in Sevilla. It may be a prime tourism destination, but it's also the country's 5th poorest city, a situation that's gaining ground among Spain's middle-class families. Families like Salud's. Every morning on her way to work, she drops off her twins at a school in the Palmita neighbourhood, where the NGO Save the Children fills in the gaps in Spain's welfare system, offering the children games and educational activities.
New families have arrived, people who've lost their jobs or who work in very precarious conditions and no longer have any social benefits. Our main concern is that this kind of poverty is turning into a chronic phenomenon.
Salud lives with her family in her parents' house, along with her sisters' and her brothers' families. Both she and her husband have jobs. She works as a domestic help and he is a builder, but they can't afford to pay the rent on a home of their own.
My mother helps us out. She puts food on the table every day and buys breakfast for the kids. That way we manage.
Out of work for several years following the economic crisis, Salud's husband finally found work a few months ago. But the wages are unreliable, she says.
The first month he earned €800, the second €900, the third €550. It's a total disaster. We don't know what we're going to earn from one month to the next. It varies, depending on how many hours work we get. So I save money the months I earn more, which I spend when I earn less, because otherwise there are months when we couldn't even afford to pay the bills.
In another part of Sevilla, in the heart of the Old Town, we meet Manolo. He's an activist with the so-called Platform for Mortgage Victims, the PAH.
¿Qué tal, amigos? Buenas tardes. Os presento a Valerie, y ahora encontramos pues cada uno le contáis a ella.
Most of the people we meet here used to lead comfortable lives. The crisis has changed all that. In debt, unable to cope with prohibitive bank rates, some have already lost their homes. Others are fighting to keep theirs.
These are our offices. I lost my home, and now a court case is underway. The bank is likely to seize the place. And even then, when the sentence is passed, I'll have to continue paying off my debt.
Until when?
For the rest of my life.
Today, Celestina lives with her 2 children in her 25-year-old son's flat. With his monthly salary of €1,000, he provides for most of their needs. Celestina's fall brought on serious depression and a divorce. At 53, she's trying to resurface. She's found a temporary job in a service company for the elderly for €500 a month.
I have this job for 2 or 3 months. I don't know how long it will last. Every day I look for work. I never stop. I ask for help from social workers and from Caritas. They put me in touch with people, and so I send CVs to restaurants, bars, places like that. I'm just trying to find something.
Last but not least, Spain is under scrutiny for a new draft law that proposes penalties for protesters joining unauthorized demonstrations. The opposition says the new draft law is meant to silence protesters as the country struggles with a debt crisis and high unemployment. The government, however, has defended the law, saying it will help regulate and protect public freedoms. The new law the government is pushing for has foreseen fines from $1,300 up to $1 million for disobedient demonstrators. Madrid's harsh spending cuts and rising unemployment have sparked massive anti-government protests across the country in recent years. Protesters argue that the government-imposed measures have failed to curb rising poverty or help the nation get out of its worst recession in years. After Lamont Weber, international lawyer, joins me from Vancouver. Welcome, sir. Mr. Weber, up to $1 million a fine for joining protests. It makes Spain the first in the world. I mean, why is Madrid so afraid of protests that it has allocated such a big fine?
Well, first, just to see how outrageous this is from a legal point of view, this proposed law is an outright violation of Articles 19 and 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 19 says everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And Article 20 says everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. And in a country where there's over 20% unemployment, to have a €30,000 fine for covering your face or for uttering, quote, slogans offensive to Spain is a clear violation of Articles 19 and Articles 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this is not going to go over lightly in Spain because recently a Spanish judge ruled that a demonstration right next to the home of the Deputy Prime Minister was not a crime and was perfectly legal. So this is going against the culture of the courts and their defense of liberties, both under the UN Declaration of Human Rights and under the European Convention on Human Rights as well. Now,
called as a witness in a long-running corruption trial that's already shaken his Conservative People's Party. As you can see, he's already taken the stand there. That trial started just a few minutes ago outside Madrid. Our correspondent in the Spanish capital is Sarah Morris.
This is a massive case that has been under investigation and going through various courts in Spain for the last 10 years, and it centres around a man called Francisco Correa, who used to like to go under the nickname Don Vito after the character in The Godfather. Essentially what he did is he set up a series of companies to cream off money from public funds using his contacts with members of the People's Party, which of course is Mariano Rajoy's party. And Mariano Rajoy today will be asked about how much he knew about exactly what Francisco Correa and the other suspects in this trial were up to. He'll be asked probably about another trial investigation that's underway called the Bárcenas Papers, about a former treasurer who claims and is being accused of running a slush fund for the People's Party. It will be a difficult day for Mariano Rajoy. He's not one of the suspects. He's not been accused of wrongdoing, and he does deny any knowledge of any of the events that went on in his party. But nevertheless, he'll get some very, very uncomfortable questions today indeed.
And how damaging is this for Mariano Rajoy?
Well, some of the damage has already been done because the People's Party lost its absolute majority in the last general election in 2015. And it is really one of the main reasons, the corruption allegations against the party, as to why Mr. Rajoy now finds himself running a minority government. But nevertheless, it will depend how he handles himself today, because he will have to answer the truth and the whole truth. And he'll be warned that if he purges himself by saying that he doesn't know something, that he does know something about, later events could do him even more political damage. He'll have to be trying to contain the damage. And we know that the People's Party is trying to put out the message that he is helping the justice system with its investigations, that he might be the first prime minister sitting in Spain to be in this position, but they're looking to the rest of Europe, and his team is saying that other prime ministers, notably in France, have also found themselves in this predicament. He's not the first.
Police in Spain arrested 24 people in an anti-corruption operation in the Valencia region on Tuesday. Many of those detained belonged or used to belong to the country's ruling People's Party, the PP. The offences relate to alleged payments of illegal commissions in exchange for public works contracts. A spokesman said the police are investigating cases of influence peddling, bribery and money laundering. We'll take action against all of those affected. I must forcefully insist that we have a commitment to the citizens in the fight against corruption, and on that we're inflexible. As time goes by, as if someone needed yet another example, the regeneration of democracy and the idea of the People's Party in government again are two opposing forces. Premises raided included the La Murta football stadium of Chativa Olympic. The club's former president, Alfonso Rus, is one of the people detained. This is the latest example in a string of corruption scandals in Spain.
It is the story of a pseudoscientific mania that swept the corridors of power, a mania that deprived tens of thousands of the most fundamental human right, that of procreation, and sought to deprive them of much more than that, based on nothing more than the assertion that the poor and destitute did not deserve to pass on their genes. The rich and powerful deserved to be rich and powerful by virtue of their very genetic makeup. Who could argue with that? And its implicit demand to cull the useless eaters of the third world.
It made me think about what our blind spots can do to us as well-intentioned people, and that sometimes, perhaps, we're not as inclusive as others as we think we are. That it is true that we are all human beings, and that we are all alike. We share a human experience. Paradoxically, however, we are all uniquely different. In this bullet point is we are like some people more than others, that we have a propensity for affinity bias. We have a preference to surround ourselves with people who are like us. However, it is nevertheless a part of the human experience that we all have a deep need to feel included. So you would think that if we all have a deep need to feel included, that the path to inclusion would be smooth, flat, and completely without obstacles. And yet I'd like to suggest to you today that not only is it not flat and smooth, it's actually filled with visible and invisible obstacles that stop us, even when we think we're being inclusive, from being fully inclusive. It will not surprise you to know that our in-group is smaller than our out-group. But it may surprise you that in recent years, in the field of neuropsychology, has been able to demonstrate that the neural pathways that we use when we think about ourselves and the neural pathways we use when we think about members of our in-group are the same neural pathways, causing us to be much more empathetic and much more sympathetic to people in our in-group. We use different neural pathways for people in our out-group, causing us to be somewhat indifferent to their success or failure.
Spain is steadily becoming a nation of ghost towns, with empty apartment blocks, streets and weed-filled gardens where bustling communities were supposed to move. Entire housing estates built during the country's boom years have been left abandoned, bricked up and now on sale for almost half their original price. One such settlement is Cesena, dubbed the Manhattan of Madrid for its towering apartments and proximity to the capital, where 30,000 people were due to live. Of the 13,000 homes due to be built, only 5,100 were completed, most of them now uninhabited, and the Spaniards who bought them as investments now competing to offload them for huge losses. Spain's housing market crash and economic implosion have turned what was supposed to become a vibrant suburban paradise for young Spanish couples and their children.
And I've always had great respect for nature, because as farmers we live off the land. It nourishes us. And this philosophy fits the concept of renewable energy, because ultimately it's the same thing. You transfer the agricultural way of thinking to a more advanced technology.
Antonio Alcaraz invested €180,000 in 2 of these solar modules. He and more than 400 other small investors created Spain's biggest cooperative solar park. But the modern facility is currently losing money because the conservative government has drastically cut the subsidies for solar power.
I feel swindled by my own government, by the politicians we Spaniards voted into office. It's a disgrace. The politicians don't care about the well-being of the citizens. Unfortunately, that's how it is.
The big energy companies regard us small investors as enemies because we threaten their monopoly on the market. The big Spanish companies want to maintain their monopoly, and they have managed to get the government to agree to their demands.
Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy has come under massive pressure because of his energy policy. Thousands of solar farmers have taken his government to court, while foreign investors are suing for damages. The claims add up to billions of euros. Spain's politicians and the big energy companies decline to make statements in front of the camera.
Our politicians secure their pensions by joining the boards of the energy companies. Given that, it's hardly surprising that they conduct this policy of weakening renewable energy and reinforcing nuclear energy and other sectors. I think it's appalling that the government wants money from us for using a natural resource like the sun. As you can see, our roofs are unused. No solar cells anywhere. unlike the countries in Northern Europe, where many people use solar energy for their own consumption.
But Antonio Alcaraz isn't letting it get him down. He wants to be a role model for his children. And he's convinced that clean energy is possible, especially in sunny Spain.
Every morning when Emilio Moliner opens his pharmacy in Barcelona, he's never sure it won't be for the last time. The regional government normally reimburses him for the prescriptions he fills, but in the meantime they owe him a pile of money. That's because the region of Catalonia is heavily in debt, so Moliner has to finance the pharmaceuticals himself. We're furious about this. We have to provide our customers with medications, but we don't know how to finance them. So we have to pay for the drugs in advance, and we don't think that's right. Many pharmacists are in the same boat. The regional government owes them a total of over 200 million euros. Many try to take out loans until they get compensated. It's been especially difficult for approximately 18 months, because banks simply have no more money to lend. And also the pharmacists have to bear the extra costs of credit. No hospitals have had to close yet, but the government is cracking down on health spending. Vacancies in the public sector are no longer being filled, including in the police department. Many local people complain about this, but they reject Madrid's claims that Catalonia is to blame for its own debt problems. It's simply not true that Catalonia is solely responsible for the high deficit. All of Spain has run up these debts. They want to blame us for it. The others are just as much at fault. The policies of the central government aren't fair, and they're hurting Catalonia. The Catalonian regional government also rejects criticism of its budget management. The region says it pays 20% of Spain's total tax, but receives no investment in return. And it says Madrid has fobbed off its cutbacks onto the regions. But external observers say Catalonia is still spending too much and that its bid for independence from Spain is also costly. Pharmacist Emilio Moliner is just hoping to recoup the money the government owes him. And he's hoping to stay in business by selling enough of the products that aren't covered by government health insurance.
A civil war which killed up to 500,000 people, followed by a 36-year-long dictatorship synonymous with oppression, forced labour and executions, during which some estimate another 500,000 died. At the heart of it, Francisco Franco El Caudillo. It began with a military rebellion against the fragile left-wing government. There was no swift victory, but with support from Hitler and Mussolini, Franco led the nationalists to power in 1939. His regime was brutal. Thousands of his political opponents executed in hundreds of concentration camps. Thousands of others fled to countries like France, kept in camps just the other side of the Pyrenees Mountains. Later, many sent to the Nazi death camps. Spain was ostracised by the UN, but in the 50s, as the brutal nature of Franco's regime eased and the Cold War deepened, Spain slowly reintegrated with the West. Franco remained in power until his death in 1975, the country then making the transition from dictatorship to democracy. 40 years after his death, Franco's ghost still haunts Spain. Whilst the UN and many Spaniards demand official recognition of crimes committed during his regime, others still honour him at a mass at the mausoleum where he's buried. Well, our correspondents Valerie Le Bon and Sarah Morris revisit Madrid for France 24.
¿Dónde están los crímenes del franquismo?
40 years after the death of Francisco Franco, two rival camps still clash over his legacy. On one side, the victims of Franco's regime waving Republican flags. On the other, phalangists with fascist salutes and chants. It's a reminder that Spain remains divided. Outside Madrid's City Hall, the Republicans demand justice.
De los 150.000 desaparecidos, de los casi 40.000 niños robados, de todos los que fueron represaliados.
Outside the royal palace, the pro-Franco group pays tribute to the Caudillo. Among them is José Luis, the leader of a tiny right-wing organisation which dreams of the return of national Catholicism.
There's no day more important than this one, nor is there a more important place. The Plaza del Oriente is where Franco used to meet his supporters. We've been holding this rally here for the past 40 years.
These people are nostalgic for the dictatorship. They think General Franco saved Spain from communism and presided over a prosperous era of full employment. But the regime also instigated a bloody civil war and 40 years of repression. Every time Chato walks through Puerta del Sol Square, he remembers being tortured by the political police.
We were tortured in the rooms you can see up there. Lots of memories come back to me. After the torture, they locked us up in the basement behind one of those small windows. And I remember I used to like to hear the noise outside. It reassured me that life went on, that it wasn't just about horror and torture.
The General Directorate of Security became the symbol of Francoist terror. A student in the early 70s, Chato was arrested 4 times for being a member of the Communist Party. He knows who his torturers were. The one he most remembers is still alive and living just a few streets away from his home.
We're at number 6 in Paseo de la Habana. And Antonio González Pacheco, known as Billy the Kid, lives on the first floor. He's the symbol of state terrorism in my country. He's a compulsive torturer. I couldn't possibly count the number of people he tortured.
Victims have tried for years to put Pacheco on trial, but Billy the Kid is protected by a 1977 amnesty law passed 2 years after Franco's death. Chato finds it hard to accept the former Franco officer enjoying his retirement.
More than the torture, what upsets me today is that 40 years after the end of the dictatorship and 80 years after the rise of fascism, we're still classed as the criminals in our society. There's been absolutely no recognition of what he did.
These people have never been able to give their evidence in court. Today, for the first time, we're going to hear their voices.
The victims of the regime have formed an association and organised this meeting so that everyone can tell their stories, so that everyone may hear the truth. For years, Chato has kept his nightmares to himself. But today he recounts an ordeal that lasted 14 days.
However strong you thought you were, it's difficult when you find yourself being urinated on, when you urinate blood. I thought I'd never again in my life be able to have sex. I was 22 and I decided to be strong. I survived thanks to my anger. I survived not because of my political convictions, but because of my anger. Because at least I was a human being.
There aren't any laws in Spain against public veneration of Francoism. In Madrid, there's still a Francisco Franco Foundation. In Spain, it's practically impossible to seek justice for the dictatorship's crimes. Most professionals who've tried to help have found their careers affected. The most public example was the case of Judge Baltasar Garzón.
After attacking the dictatorships of Argentina and Chile and other cases of universal jurisdiction, I wasn't going to stop doing it because of a fear that the descendants of Francoism would attack me. When you have a public position like I did, You have to assume that risk, particularly if it's about defending the law.
In 2008, he agreed to investigate the crimes committed during the Civil War and the dictatorship. But that angered the extreme right, which brought a case against him for abusing his power. Spain's most famous magistrate was found guilty and suspended for 11 years.
The panel has agreed unanimously to suspend the judge.
His suspension caused indignation. Many Spaniards believe he's the victim of a political conspiracy, led by the Conservative People's Party.
Spanish justice is very independent as a whole, but at the top, that's less the case. That's where you seem to find interests at work. In my case, the maneuvers of certain people in the People's Party for things to happen in a certain way and not in another are very clear. That's been said publicly, that has been written and proven.
Garzón continues his mission to defend human rights as a lawyer. Despite 40 years of democracy, the spectres of Francoism still stalk the corridors of power.
The right hasn't completely cut ties with Francoism. It still has sentimental, emotional links, ideological and psychological links. Even if, and let's be clear about it, no one wants to bring back Francoism. It's over. But there's a sector of society that doesn't want to draw the relevant conclusions.
North of Madrid, in the Valley of the Fallen, there's a giant basilica containing Franco's tomb. Built on the orders of the dictator by Republican prisoners, it pays tribute to those killed on both sides during the Civil War. Beneath this giant cross lie the bodies of more than 33,000 people, most of them Republicans. The monument's become a rallying point for Franco's admirers, particularly on November the 20th, the anniversary of the caudillo's death.
It's the least we can do to thank the caudillo for the Spain he left us. Look at the state Spain is in today. When he was here, even if I didn't live back then, but from what I know and what older people have told me, the Franco era was the best period Spain has ever known.
The 2007 historical memory law intended the basilica to be depoliticised, but old habits die hard. Fascist songs and salutes are banned outside the monument, but not inside. It's just one example of the weakness of the law that aimed to recognise the dictatorship's crimes. Purification thinks the bodies of her grandfather and great-uncle, anarchists shot at the start of the Civil War, are buried in this giant ossuary. She feels angry every time she visits the basilica.
It's like being permanently humiliated knowing that my loved ones are with Franco's remains, that and the masses.
The couple have tried everything to recover their family members' remains in order to rebury them in another tomb. All their legal claims have failed. Hundreds of thousands of tourists visit the basilica every year but find no information explaining its history. The couple would like the Valley of the Fallen to be turned into a place where crimes are remembered, as they are at concentration camps in Germany.
I would take the cross down, and I wouldn't blow it up, as some people have said. I would take it down and I would make a center dedicated to understanding the Civil War. Lots of prisoners died here. Even if it was said that they came to work here happily, they were actually slaves.
In April 2014, Chatto's struggle for justice brings him face to face with Billy the Kid again. Chatto and other victims managed to convince an Argentinian judge to investigate allegations about the Franco era.
Justice Garzón used the universal jurisdiction principle to prosecute the crimes of Argentina's dirty war. The Argentinian judge sought Billy's extradition, but the Spanish court rejected the request.
I feel really bad, even if I had prepared myself for coming here. We'll drag them to the international courts. We'll continue to go on with this case in Argentina and with the fight in my country. And given how things are going, I'm sure we'll get there.
In one last insult, Billy the Kid, who hides his face from the cameras, mocks the crowd as he leaves the court. The United Nations has condemned Spain's stance. The organisation says crimes carried out under Franco are crimes against humanity, and international conventions on human rights should be applied.
Spain has an international obligation to investigate, judge and, if possible, punish those who are responsible. Spain hasn't declassified archives, it hasn't passed a law allowing access to information, it hasn't instructed public prosecutors to start investigations. The state is playing practically no role at all in this subject.
The People's Party, which has governed for the last 4 years, refuses to follow the UN's recommendations. We asked the Justice Minister himself for an explanation.
We've had a solid democracy for several decades now, where public rights and freedoms are recognized and where all citizens live together, respecting everyone's ideologies. We're a democracy with all the elements that prove that. And I can tell you that that painful period has been happily overcome by everyone.
Behind this barbed wire, there once stood the hated Carabanchel prison. Chato was held there several times. He wanted to turn it into Madrid's first memorial to the victims of Francoism. But in 2008, almost 10 years after it was abandoned, the jail was demolished on the orders of the socialist government.
Denying the existence of sites where these crimes were carried out, or denying we exist as victims of that dictatorship, is about erasing the existence of torturers and executioners. It's a way of erasing their responsibilities.
After a life of struggle, of humiliation and small victories, Chato and his fellow victims may never gain their proper place in the history books. By refusing a full debate on the crimes of Francoism, Spain seeks to forget rather than face up to the deep wounds of its past.
Valerie Le Bon and Sarah Morris revisiting Madrid for France 24.